Welcome. I'm so glad to see so many familiar faces with us tonight. My name is Siobhan Devaney, and I'm the Director of Alumni and Alumni Relations here at Hobart William Smith. I'm a William Smith grad of the classes of 1995. And so I'm very, very excited to welcome you here all tonight to hear and speak with another William Smith grad, Tamara Payne. Before we get started, I'm incredibly excited to have with us this evening two very dear friends with whom I've had the pleasure to converse and learn from over this past year. This program tonight is being co-sponsored by the Afro-Latino Alumni and Alumni Association, otherwise known as ALA. And I'm grateful to two of the sponsors tonight who made available 13 copies of Tamara's book for students. And so we'll drop my email in the chat sometime later today or tonight for students to email me. The first 13 students who send an email will get a copy of my book, or my book, Tamara's book. And those two alums are Skip Darden, class of 87, and Rick Wallace, classes of 1991. So I'm really excited to be able to bring this program to you tonight. Okay, so now we're going to jump right in. Khuram Hussain, who will be leading our conversation with Tamara this evening, is an associate professor in education and vice president for diversity, equity, and inclusion here at the colleges. He earned his PhD from Syracuse University in the Cultural Foundations of Education. His scholarship examines Black American struggles to reinscribe education as a site for culturally responsive, community-oriented democratic learning. He is an historian of Muhammad Speaks, the newspaper established by Malcolm X. His recent publication, Dreamin' Differently About Freedom, Malcolm X and Muhammad Speaks, explores the emancipatory imagination of Malcolm X and his newspaper. He told me I would definitely get tripped up on some of these, the flow of this, so I am. Khuram's book, Weapons for Minds, The Political Imagery of Muhammad Speaks, 1960 to 1975, is under contract with Johns Hopkins University Press. Tamara Payne, William Smith class of 1988, earned her BA in English and was awarded the college's Martin Luther King Jr. Leadership Award at graduation. She went on to a career in teaching and real estate while working with her father, Les Payne, as principal researcher on the project that would become The Dead Are Rising. Les Payne, a former editor at Newsday and a founder of the National Association of Black Journalists, first interviewed Malcolm's brother, Philbert and Wilfred, in 1990. According to the publisher, this was the beginning of his quest to interview anyone he could find who had actually known Malcolm X. All living siblings of the Malcolm Little family, classmates, street friends, cellmates, Nation of Islam figures, FBI moles and cops, and political leaders around the world. Payne's goal was ambitious: to transform what would become over 100 hours of interviews into an unprecedented portrait of Malcolm X, one that would separate fact from fiction. The epic biography of Malcolm X, begun by the late Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist Les Payne and completed by his daughter, Tamara Payne, was named the winner of the 2020 National Book Award for Nonfiction. You can follow Tamara on Instagram, and we will put her Instagram in the chat for you, or email her through her website, thedeadarehorizon.com. Khuram?
Thank you, Chevy. Welcome, everyone. It's wonderful to see all your faces. I'm grateful that people have their cameras on and their mics off, at least for now. And I look forward to the conversation we're going to have with Tamara Payne. I am delighted to have this conversation with Tamara. I want to say a couple things before we jump into the conversation, though. First off, I want to actually read to you what the judges said while granting the National Book Foundation Award in November. They said that this book by Les and Tamara Payne refuse a simplistic, I'm going to read from the screen now so we can all read together. Refuse a simplistic depiction of Malcolm X, one of our greatest and most misunderstood Americans. Malcolm's story the rise from street criminal to devoted moralist and revolutionary, is as unlikely as it is profound. Incisive and comprehensive, this intensely human portrait is written with a dedicated beauty and uncompromising detail that matches Malcolm's life, his own life. And I have to say that for those that haven't read it, I would welcome you to bear witness to a lot of the truth of that depiction, both the elegance and the precision, but also the depth. I have to mention that since winning the National Book Award, the book has also won the NAACP Image Award for Outstanding Literary Work for a biography or autobiography. And if that wasn't enough, the book beat out Barack Obama's recent book. So there you go. You heard it here first. So I'm excited for a lot of reasons, as Chev mentioned. This is an area that I personally care deeply about as a scholar and an educator. And one of the things that was really striking to me was when I began my research on Malcolm X, was learning how incredibly dedicated he was to empowering and being empowered by Black journalists. Malcolm himself studied photojournalism, started a newspaper, and worked very hard to get the best Black journalists in America to work for his newspaper. And so the idea that this book was written by journalists, I have to say there's a poetry and a full circle kind of feeling to it, because these were the kinds of writers and intellectuals that Malcolm very much wanted to empower and to be empowered by, and more importantly, to empower communities, Black communities in particular. So with that, I want to put forward my first question to Tamara, right? And again, hi, Tamara, it's good to see you.
Hi.
Thank you for coming back to Hobart William Smith Colleges this way. It's wonderful to have you here. What I'd like to do is actually have you begin by sharing a little bit about your father and his life and how his view of the world shaped his approach to the book.
That's a wonderful question, a great way to start off. I just want to first give thanks to Allah, the Alumni Association, for co-sponsoring this program, and a special shout out and thank you to Skip Darden and Rick Wallace. And I also wanted to kind of mention that my mother's here, Violet Payne. My brother will probably be showing up, Jamal, and I do see that some other family and beloved friends are here, and I just wanted to give acknowledgement that they're here. But getting back to my father saw the power of journalism while he was serving in the U.S. Army. And he first of all, I just start off that he was born in 1941 in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and he stayed there until he was age 12. His family moved up to Hartford, Connecticut, where, so what this means is that he has a firsthand experience in growing up in Jim Crow South. And then when he goes up north in Connecticut, there's family in here experiencing the obstacles that stand in the way of Black people who are just trying to live their lives, buying houses and getting jobs and even going to college. And then my father, also saw Malcolm X speak at University of Connecticut in Storrs in 1963. But when he goes off when he's graduating, he has, to think about what he wants to do with his career. And he ends up going into the Army at the time of the Vietnam War. And so it was during that time in Vietnam and serving with the U.S. Army that he first kind of sees the power of journalism. He served as an Army Ranger for 6 years with the U.S. Army. He obtained the rank of captain, but during his assignment in Vietnam, he ran the command newspaper as an Army journalist, and wrote messages and speeches for the commanding General William C. Westmoreland. But also while in Vietnam, he had the opportunity to show a reporter who was working for the Washington Post, who was writing a series about what was with the life of US troops in Vietnam. And in one of these articles that he had written, he wrote about how the Americal Division had American Confederate flag emblazoned on their trucks. And after reading this story, the then President Johnson phoned General Westmoreland at 3 o'clock Saigon time in the morning and cursed him out and told him that those flags need to be removed. All of that had to be removed. And what this showed my father was that journalism could be a powerful tool. He believed that the power of revealed facts reported by a free press that is protected by the US Constitution, a free press that is determined to inform the public about what is going on. And he saw that this would help the people when they receive information, make informed decisions. And so he wanted to use that once he got into journalism after he left, got out of the Army. He landed at Newsday, where he spent 38 years. That's where his career was. And he used his time there and as a journalist, and he was a journalist to his core. And he studied the craft and passed it on to other journalists, as well as opening up opportunities for other Blacks and other minorities to come into the field and tell and broaden the stories that were being reported in journalism. He won the Pulitzer Prize in 1974 for his work on the heroin trail, which followed the heroin from Turkish poppy fields through the French Connection into the veins of American teenagers. And in 1976, he spent 2.5 months in South Africa reporting a 11-part series on the Soweto uprising. And he was given, while reporting, he was given the honorary white designation so that he could come and go and not be hindered by the Blacks only policies that people of his shade would have to deal with. But he also used his ability as a Black man to pass as a Black. And he would drive into the Black townships and he would report about the real conditions of Black people living under apartheid. And he also investigated the numbers of people who were killed by the police, in which we would find through his reporting that they were seriously underreported. And this series got him banned from South Africa. He was not allowed to come back in to report any further stories. There are a lot of situations that surround that. I won't go into them today. But in 1990, he was invited back to when de Klerk decided to free Nelson Mandela. And my father was invited back. So there is a photograph here as one of the slides, this one right here, where my father's, this is in 1990, where Nelson Mandela, before he was made president, but just released from prison, my father was able to interview him there. So that's a little bit about him. But also 1990 was the year that my father first met and interviewed Malcolm's brothers. And that was really a changing event for him because what he was learning from his interviews with these brothers, and he met one through his friend, and he was amazed by the stories I was learning about the family and the childhood and the household of Louise and Earl Little. And he comes back to New York and he speaks with a colleague of his, Gil Noble, who had hosted a very powerful show here in New York called Like It Is. And he also was very familiar with the Little family. He said, "Which brother did you speak to?" My father told him it was Filbert. He says, "Wilfred is the one that you should speak to." So my father went back to Detroit and he met Wilfred, and he also sat down for several hours and interviewed him. And he learned a lot more about Malcolm's childhood and growing up in his life. But the other thing he learned from Wilfred is that Malcolm and Wilfred were best friends. Wilfred was Malcolm's confidant. And he was open to talking to my father and telling the story about what that was like and who Malcolm was. And having the story of Malcolm, the person, put out there publicly. And this was at a time when Malcolm was also obviously, we were hearing his speeches were playing out in the streets with vendors here in New York on 125th Street, but in other places throughout the country. And we're hearing more about Malcolm in the music, in rap music. And we're hearing, Spike Lee is starting to direct his movie and put that story together. So Malcolm's name was in the air, his visage was everywhere, and he was becoming popular again. But I would argue that Malcolm never really left the stage after his assassination in 1965. But he was becoming important. And this story and what my father learned from those interviews was that we don't really know a lot about Malcolm. Malcolm has always been presented fully formed and angry, as if he sprung out of nowhere. And here we get to look at Malcolm as a human being, Malcolm as a son, Malcolm as a brother, and his parents, Earl and Louise, who are followers of Marcus Garvey and members of the UNI and organizers. I mean, not just followers but they were organizers, and they were moving to towns where they were organizing other families. And getting these stories and understanding what that means was important to filling out this picture of Malcolm and what we don't know about him. But then how does Malcolm, come to be able to be so important to us if we don't know where he comes from? So Dad really wanted to tell the story of who Malcolm was, but also put in the context of not just his family but he wanted to put in the context of the world he was born into.
Tamara, so struck by that description, right? That he is presented to us in a vacuum, fully formed and angry, right? And yet, as you said, right, here is an opportunity to look at him as a human being, and such an important part of that is to see him as a member of a family. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about what insights you and your father were able to draw from the exploration of his family history. And since we started this story as a father-daughter story, and I want to come back to that, because I think a lot of folks are going to really be interested in how you came into this project. And I really appreciate what you've shared about your father. And so we'll come back to that in a moment. But I'm curious about Malcolm's parents, Malcolm's mother, Malcolm's father, and what role they played in shaping the later Malcolm that we may know some of, and that if we read this, we'll learn even more about.
Yeah, I'm kind of torn between where to kind of start. I want to read a little bit from the book, and I kind of want to start with the beginning, just so we can see this world of Malcolm. But Dad wanted to bring the audience into Malcolm's life, and the story. So I'll just start from the beginning. The metallic clicking of hoofbeats on the gravel road drew 5-year-old Wilfred to the small pane window. His mother, wiping her hands, hurried to the front door as a group of horsemen with flickering torches rode up to their wood frame home on the outskirts of Omaha, Nebraska. "Little," yelled one of the half-dozen men. Louise Little said that her husband was not at home, and with tree leaves rustling in the evening breeze, the horsemen steadied their mounts in the front yard and declared that they were knights of the Ku Klux Klan. "Get that nigger out here now," one of the strangers shouted. Hauntingly, a young housewife, precise in her West Indian accent, said that her family didn't cause trouble or bother neighbors, that they minded their own business. The excitement of the horses died down for young Wilfred as his mother folded her arms. Seen against this flickering kerosene light, she was a sight to at least momentarily might have given the white vigilantes pause. Light complexioned, with the thick hair flowing to her waist. Mrs. Little stood taller than the average man of her day, at more than 5 feet 8 inches, and she was pregnant. She was big, Wilfred said years later. She was expecting at any time. "Y'all better get out of town," said the man in the front, exclaiming that they didn't tolerate troublemakers. Bristling before the young family, the Klansmen clutched their shotguns by the trigger housing and made all kinds of threats, aimed chiefly against the man of the house. The unfolding drama puzzled the eldest child of the household. "I didn't know what to make of it," Wilfred recalled. "My mother was angry, so naturally I'm angry too. My mother is challenging him, Verbally, she never used any profanity. Still, several of the men waved guns toward the door of the as another spurred his horse forward, shaking his torch at the defiant Mrs. Little. "My mother kept arguing," Wilfred said. "The Klan leader got mad. He took the butt of his rifle and knocked the front window out. Baby brother Filbert started crying in the back room, and 3-year-old Hilda tugged at her mother's house dress. If fear of the gunman gripped Mrs. Little, her children detected no sign in her home in her tone or her body language. And Wilfred, as Wilfred recalled the incident years later, the children, in fact, drew lasting strength from the manner in which their mother stood her ground that spring evening before bullying white strangers on horseback. However, contrary to his initial impression, Wilfred would conclude later that it would help greatly that his father was indeed not at home. And just wanted to show you, this is the world Malcolm's point. Louise is pregnant with Malcolm at this point. And here you have the Ku Klux Klan at their doorstep, threatening them.
There's a description there that, I mean, there's so much about that that's so striking. But, you know, as you think about and try to imagine the world in which she's standing, as you write, as your father writes, challenging, defiant. But what sticks out is that last sentence, lasting strength. That what the kids saw was lasting strength.
Yes. Yeah. Louise and Earl, you know, they instilled strength, hard work, character into their children. And it wasn't just Malcolm who was receiving this, all the siblings received this. And I just think that it's such a confirmation to who Malcolm is, the man that we've all come to admire, that we see it in the beginning of where he's coming from, that right. This is coming from something. We all are coming from something, right? Our families and our ancestors and generations before us, they affect us. The decisions that they have made, whether they, in this case, they are Garveyites, this is what brings them together and holds them together. And this is a through line through Malcolm's life, Garveyism. Following Marcus Garvey, building up their community, strengthening their community in a society that is anti-Black people, you know, that's working diligently and has laws, by the way, to, you know, keep Black people subordinate, you know. And this family is working and they're not the only ones, but this family is working to, you know, to keep a place and build a community in which Black people can still thrive.
I'm wondering about, you know, well, first off, I just want to make an observation about where we oftentimes identify Malcolm's strength. You know, where that is often kind of individuated, or maybe it comes out of the NOI, but, you know, you give it much deeper roots by connecting right. it to his mother, to his father, to Garveyism. But, you know, even, you know, looking at the eulogy of Malcolm as the shining prince, this through line in his life is that he becomes a symbol of dignity and strength throughout his life. And so to kind of read this story, or hear you read this story, and to appreciate the kind of reverberations this will have for generations, right? Even today, young people, they vibrate, right? They still experience the strength of Malcolm. And so in so many ways, that image of his mother now becomes a powerful part of where that comes from. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about Garveyism, because not everyone may be familiar with it.
Right.
And you say it's a through line in his life.
Right. Well, Marcus Garvey, you know, came here from Jamaica. He was an organizer and a publisher and from out of Jamaica, but he had a belief in Black people. And when he came here and looking for, you know, to further his opportunities, and just seeing this where we were in the community, and he just saw a different way for us to thrive. And so he focused on the Black community and strengthening and building businesses and through, you know, not necessarily through their church, but through their community and the community ties that they built up. And this is important. And then it's also about controlling the image. You know, he would have parades, for example, in New York, where people would dress up in the refinery. But more importantly, you know, it's really about embracing who we are as Black people in the positive way, not the negative image and the negative descriptions that society is telling us. And I'll give you even more example of like how this plays out in the Little household. from our book. This is in the chapter, for those of you that do have this, The Anchor is Lost. The story of Little Black Sambo, published in 1899 by British writer Helen Bannerman, was a standard children's reader at Pleasant Grove. The illustrations of the dark Indian child caused derisive snickering among whites, but the pickaninny slur, along with the unrestrained banding about of the term nigger, repulsed the little children who were taught at home to disparage such put-downs of the Black race. And again, this is the presence of Garveyism in their life. As the taunts escalated, it was their mother, Louise, who conditioned Malcolm and his siblings not to overreact to the racial slurs. We didn't like being called a nigger, Wilfred said, but we would try to downplay it. My mother always told us that you can handle racial slurs in a way where you make them continue, or you can let them think they're not hurting you. She would give an example. If you're throwing darts at a dartboard, there's satisfaction you can get when you hit the target. When you miss it, you get another feeling. Well, she said, it's the same with white people. When they're throwing darts at you, by doing things they say and do, but if they didn't hit the target, then they don't get the satisfaction, and eventually they'll quit. And usually that's the way it works. This psychological training for resistance to racial provocation was conditioned into the behavior of young Malcolm and his siblings. Their behavior earned grudging respect among a growing number of whites in their neighborhood, despite, and in some cases because of, their adherence to Garveyism. So Garveyism is giving them that strength to be able to deflect, because they're coming from a place that gives them the strength to understand, yes, we don't like being called this, but also we know better that we're not this. And they will also get in trouble. The children would get in trouble in classes because they came off as being proud, and the teachers would send notes home to the parents saying, that they were disruptive because of their pride. And Louise would go up and deal with the teachers on that.
It strikes me as two key elements of that strength that are in the subtext there: self-love, self-affirmation, that you are enough as you are, that those are, again, these really powerful portals through which Malcolm is experienced and understood by generations. And here it is, right, at this early age, this strength, this self-love, this self-affirmation.
Mm-hmm. And not just self-love and self-affirmation, but just knowing that you're doing the right thing. What laws are you breaking by, starting your business and supporting the businesses of people who look like you? And this is important. This is not something to be looked down on. Doesn't mean that you have, lesser quality in products, but this is something that they were building on. And it went even further than that, because again, when you see Garveyism, as you look later on in this book, it becomes a through line also in the Nation of Islam, when they're talking about building their own schools and they have their own temples, and they have their own stores, their own restaurants, and eventually their own farms. This is all comes out of that self-determination of how you control what you can do in your communities. But again, it's being set up against, because you have people who are looking at this and saying, they don't want to see that.
Right. And I think that you do a really thorough kind of process of unraveling a lot of the misconceptions about Malcolm X and things that have oftentimes in the popular media at the time been described as hateful. And really, they weren't hateful as you describe. Oftentimes, Malcolm's primary audience simply wasn't white people. Even when he was sometimes talking to white folks, he was really talking to Black communities about how to empower themselves economically, politically, psychologically, culturally. And so I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about some of those misconceptions that the book helps to disabuse. What was revealing for you, or maybe there were things that you knew and then the research helped to elaborate on.
Well, one of my favorite examples I like to use is the one when we talk about self-defense, because a lot of people still like to say that Malcolm preached violence, right? Mm-hmm. But Malcolm wasn't preaching violence, he was preaching self-defense. And this, I'll go outside of the book and really to just let Malcolm speak for himself on this, and that, because it's important how he says this, and it's current. You know, when he would talk about, let me see where I have it here, self-defense. When you take this position of self-defense, he says that basically what was happening is that we had the Klan coming into the community and lynching people. And people go to the authorities, whether it's the local authorities and even on a larger scale, the federal government. And, you know, and then they're saying that there's nothing they can do. So Malcolm said, well, when they decide that they can't do anything to protect you, your rights, then you have every right to organize yourselves and defend yourselves. And there's nothing wrong with that. And you're letting the government know that if they're not going to do it, that you're going to stop the Klan yourself. But understand, and so it's like he's diagnosed the problem. Here's the problem. He's diagnosing the problem. He's explaining the problem. And then he's providing you an action to take. But then he also says that understand that when you take that position, that the media is going to call you a racist. And they're going to call you a reverse violent person. And this is a tactic that the media still does. I witnessed this happening to my father. When my father would write his columns about police brutality on Long Island in New York, you know, people would write in and call him racist. They would call him, you know, militant. And they would say, not that, you know, I mean, he thought that these were negative things, but he said, but when you're speaking truth to power like that, that's the cost of it. And Malcolm explained that to people, that is the sacrifice you're going to make. And then we kind of get into this example of when somebody does it, that's love, right? Of people. That's a love. He's sacrificing himself.
By just expressing a complete sense of humanity and agency. Can you talk a little bit more about that sense of love, right? I've heard you at times talk about it as radical love. What is radical love for Malcolm?
I mean, and this wasn't an idea that I came from. This is something I actually heard somebody else say. This is Yuri Kuchiyama's granddaughter, Kemi, said this at a gathering recently, and I agreed with, and I agree exactly with what you're saying, that Malcolm's sacrifices for Black people, and his constant work, all of the work that he was doing, whether he was in the Nation, like when he joins the Nation after, and we're speeding up on the story, but when he joins the Nation after he leaves jail, well, while in jail, actually, he's in prison, he joins the Nation. His family actually is the ones, his family brings him into the Nation, it's his brothers. And when he joins it, he sees this as not only just a vehicle of saving himself, of giving him something to pivot from, you know, the crime, you know, what he was doing with hustling, and that wasn't going anywhere. So he pivots into this, and he sees that this can be so helpful and such an incredible vehicle to help Black people, you know, overcome, you know, racism and dealing with racism, and successfully, especially if they're controlling the economics of their community as one thing, right? But even when he has these ideas and even more larger ideas, people who are in the Nation are looking at him like, who is this guy? And they constantly working against him. There's the jealousy starts in the beginning and days when he joins the Nation, when they see him trying to attract younger, college educated people and recruiting them into the Nation. This is a thing that's the people who are already in the Nation who are laborers and blue collar, they see this as a problem. This is a confrontation, and they don't like that, you know. So then they start this, you know, this jealousy starts to build up, and it never stops, you know. But Malcolm he says, look, this is part of human nature, but I'm still going to go forth with this. Even in the Nation, Elijah Muhammad sits Malcolm down early on. He says, look, you can't operate like this, not here. You know, not meaning not here in the organization, but they were in the Midwest. Malcolm was in Detroit at that time when that happened. This is in the 50s. And then this goes on for a couple of years. And then finally, you know, Elijah Muhammad sits him down and says, okay, I'm going to sit you down. I want you to cool off, but I also want you to know I'm going to give you some place to go in the East. Pick any temple you want over there. And he starts off with Boston.
So, you know, in Boston, I think it's a number of important changes that happen. in terms of his work, but also the way in which he starts to hit a national spotlight. And he's just a natural, right? And so I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that period, the East Coast, from Boston to New York, and what begins to change in the life and thinking of Malcolm. And some of this is in the autobiography, but there is a lot that isn't, because the family connection that you're able to make here is so important. His sister's in Boston, and that's such a key part of his development.
His sister Ella, who's actually his father's daughter from his first marriage, she's one of his biggest supporters. I mean, even when he was hustling, he's not unfamiliar with Boston because of her. She brings him to live with her when he's a teenager, and then he moves on into Harlem from her house. And even when he leaves Harlem, he goes back to her house. So she's one of his biggest supporters. And throughout his life, by the way, she actually also paid for his Hajj, when he leaves the nation. So again, family. We don't get anywhere really in life without our family or without help. And family can also be not just your blood family, but extended family. And so Malcolm is able to flourish because he's familiar with Boston, and he's familiar with New York, and he loves that East Coast, and he just flourishes. But he also has a supportive family and his friends, and some of them from prison, who come and join the nation, or actually go through the exercise of getting the X at least. And some of them drop off, some of them stay in there. There was a minister of one of the temples who actually served time with Malcolm. So, I mean, Malcolm he kind of hits his stride in New York and in Boston, and later in New York. And he gets to get a command of the whole East Coast, going from New York down to Philadelphia and away from the earlier temples, where Elijah Muhammad's pioneer members were there, and his energy kind of rubbed them the wrong way. But he was able to kind of thrive and really learn. And the other thing is, when we think about Malcolm, and people like to focus on his criminal days and stuff like that, but his experience as with his criminality and also moving on from that, like he went to jail, he served time, he started educating himself, reading books, debating, wanting to understand, systems of the world, right? And he still is able to use what he learned during the days when he was on the streets to recruit. And he's speaking to people in the streets, and he's speaking to people who are educated. And so not a lot of people are able to do both of those things. And he masters that, and that helps him. And he's charismatic. And the other thing he studies, because Malcolm he's so curious and he studies these things relentless, and he's reading all the time. He studies how to master television, because television is booming. Like, a lot of people would say to me, man, can you imagine what Malcolm would be like if he had the internet? I said, he had the television. And not everybody mastered the television, and certainly didn't master it like Malcolm. Malcolm had the soundbite. He created something, the way he would look in the camera, to the point that even today people, shiver when they look at some of his speeches. And he mastered that. And that, just speaks to who he was and what he was focused on, because what was he doing? He had a message that he wanted to communicate, and he knew that through television and radio and the media, that if he could use it, as well as newspapers, even with bad publicity, he would be able to get his message out. And there would be people who don't agree, but then there were people who would be attracted to that message. And he was able to do that.
And I do think he was certainly a master of how to use the camera, and understood both ends of the lens, both as sort of journalism and creating Black media, and also being able to manage mainstream media so effectively. And there seems to be a really important distinction from the ways in which some folks have mastered media today. And that is, even though we hold him up as a single icon, he's really always a member of a community. That community continues to grow and grow and grow, from Malcolm the Garveyite, Malcolm the Black nationalist, to Malcolm the internationalist. And yet he still uses that image again and again. And I wanted to just sort of offer a parallel. It just reminded me of Henry Louis Gates Jr. in his book Stony the Road talks about Frederick Douglass and these gorgeous portraits of Frederick Douglass. And Frederick Douglass was very intentional about sitting for portraits because he wanted to embody the dignity of Blackness to counter the narratives that were trying, the pickaninny kind of racist images of his era. And so even though it looks like from modern eyes, it might look like, oh, this person just really likes selfies, right? Or, Malcolm saw himself as an individual, right? But just like Frederick Douglass generations ago, he was using his image or allowing his image to be managed in a way so that he could get a message out to the world about his community. And so I'm wondering if you could talk about, what Malcolm's life teaches us about addressing struggle, injustice, or even pain at a collective level. Like what is it that Malcolm offers our understanding of what it means to be part of the community?
Well, I think Malcolm, he teaches so much, especially when it comes to addressing the struggles. I mean, he was constantly looking at ways and using his language to show people how to build yourself up in ways so that you can deflect the acts of racism that are inflicted upon you every day. And so when he's coming up with the, I just amazed, like, even when he left the nation, right? And media went after him and said, you used to call us a blue-eyed devil, right? And you're not using that anymore. And what are we to make of that? You don't believe in that anymore? And he the way he deflected it was amazing. He would just say, you can't hold me responsible, for that, because all of that was a reaction to what you were inflicting on us. It was a response. And so he was showing us, like, it's not our fault, but then comes a point where we do have to speak, we have to speak up. I mean, one of the interviews we did with Vicki Garvin, who was a labor organizer in Harlem, but she saw Malcolm at different points in his life. She saw him as Detroit Red in Harlem when he was working at Small's Paradise. She saw him again when he was a minister at the Harlem Temple and preaching on 125th Street. And then she met him again in Ghana. She was a roommate of Maya Angelou and Alice Wyndham. And so she sees him at these different points of life. But what she said, I remember what she said in our interview was that Malcolm, yeah, he was there. A lot of people were talking about, racism and what's happening in our communities. But Malcolm also said, but who are we to not take control of the economics of our community? We have to do better. There are things we can do. And again, here comes that Garveyism of build up your own thrive, build up your own community, build up your own business. And she said that in 1950, late 50s, when she heard him say that, she said nobody else was saying that on the street. And it was great to hear him say that. And she had admired that about him. But, she also said that he wasn't thinking about the world at that point, but she thought that for where he was, that was great. And so again, it's like being accountable, the accountability that we have in dealing with racism, right? And we do have accountability and we are building up. And that is a connection I think that a lot of the youth today are picking up. If you want to look at Black Lives Matter, they're taking accountability for what's going on. They're not allowing the media to be the only teller of our stories. The newspapers and they're going on websites, they're filming and posting videos, of what's really going on. We're seeing the videos of, at these protests, that, the media's talking about all this violence and the Black Lives Matter people are saying, look, it's not even us. These are people, that wasn't what we discussed when we wanted to hit the streets. And they're breaking windows and we're telling them to stop. But no, the media wasn't reporting about that early on, And so again, those lessons have been picked up by today's youth, and have been over the years. But definitely, you see that happening. You see that direct, that direct relationship. That lesson is being learned.
And in so many ways, you see the vestiges or the echoing on into the current generation of the kind of fearlessness to look into the eye of white supremacy. I mean, one of the striking stories in the book is that Malcolm X, who believed his father was murdered by the Klan, who as a child witnessed the Klan terrorize or attempt to terrorize his family, was also prepared to debate the Klan. Bring them to the podium, right? Like, he's not afraid of engaging directly, even with those that are committed as a life's practice to terrorism against Black people. And that is an unflinching commitment that also, I think, must have been rooted in a kind of self-confidence and inner strength that he'd had for a long time.
And that is not turn the other cheek. This is, I mean, I think what's really important to understand that Malcolm didn't just kind of give us solutions, but there were actions. It wasn't about being passive. It was about, there are actions that we can take and that we can move forward on and build on and be in control of, and we should take. And it is going to take courage and commitment to do that. And this has, been picked up by many people, including my father, as he was, we mentioned in his bio that he was a co-founder of the National Association of Black Journalists. Well, that was founded in the memory of Malcolm too, because when you have journalists who are trying to practice the craft, and at that time, these 44, Black men and women, they were huge icons and honestly probably didn't necessarily need the organization for themselves. They just really kind of got together. They're like, where are we? And getting together and sharing their stories. But then they also realized that there was power in numbers, and that in organizing, when one got in trouble, they can be there. They could be there to support as an organization. And the other thing that's really important about that organization is that they bring in young people. There's a huge young membership of that organization right now. That organization now is like 4,000 members strong. And I don't know that the founders believe that that's how large it would grow, or that it would still be, in existence, or that there would still be a need for it. But that it's there, and that it started with them, and it was still founded kind of in that idea of support and organizing and protecting. And if you look at when there's something that goes down with the media, over the summer even, and in the last couple of years, when people are questioning who's covering these stories and where are your Black reporters, NABJ was right there, holding people's feet, CNN, CBS, the majors, holding their feet to the fire. So I'm just kind of coming out of the book, but it's all connected and important that people understand that this is how hugely important this book is, but also how connected and relevant it is.
I want to open it up, Tamara, with the wonderful. We have 92 folks on the call right now,
Wow.
which is wonderful. Imagine if we were all together right now without masks. Someday, maybe the next time we host you. But I do want to get to some of their questions. And before we do, I just wanted to read the last page of the book.
I do want to make one mention about that Klan meeting, and that is to just explain that, because I don't want people to walk away. It's like, he met with the Klan? So the Klan, they were in Atlanta. This is in 1961. They were in Atlanta, and he was visiting the Atlanta Temple, which was the minister of that was Jeremiah Shabazz. And they received a telegram from the local Klan chapter who said, we'd like to meet. And Malcolm's response to that was, hey, this would be great to meet and have a confrontation, tell them where to go. But because Jeremiah nor Malcolm are leaders, their protocols that go back to Elijah Muhammad and have this discussion about what to do, how should we move forward. Malcolm, he's playing it close to his chest, but he really does kind of want to have a confrontation. He wants to tell them where to go. Jeremiah's position is whatever Elijah Muhammad says, we do. And Elijah Muhammad said, the Klan is very powerful. I have a Southern plan. I want to build my businesses. I want to get farms, and I want to, see what we can do about this separate state and getting and acquiring land. And the Klan members are everywhere. They're real estate agents. They're the politicians. They're the police. He says, maybe they can help us set, in setting up our businesses and moving forward on that, or maybe they can just leave us alone and not bother us as we're doing our business. So he meet with them, hear what they have to say. And so I want to very clearly understood that Malcolm still he wasn't happy about that, but he wanted to be able to impact that meeting because he didn't want them to be in a position, because it's always kind of like a compromised position that he's going in there with. But he's also realizing that perhaps that he and Elijah Muhammad, this is a huge rift. This kind of starts this rift between Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad. And it just grows after that. But that this thing of, what are you willing to give up? That's, making deals with the Klan is not, that's an unholy alliance. That's not going to work in our favor. And so Malcolm was never happy about that, and even later said, at the end of his life, that he was always embarrassed by that, his role in that.
This is, Hollywood couldn't produce stories that come out of this book. One of the Klan members is actually an FBI informant. And so part of the way, as you say in the book, the reason we know about this meeting is this informant, finally, I guess through the Freedom of Information Act, we get these files. But what was really striking to me, there's two things. One is Malcolm is unafraid. Like even here, he's looking them straight in the eyes at a time where that could cost you your life in the South. He's looking these white men in the eyes. And he's at times almost like toying with them with some of his remarks. And then there's a beautiful moment where they say, hey, we know you don't like, Martin Luther King, why don't we get together on that and cause him some harm? And he says, I would never harm one of my own. And I think it was such an important and beautiful moment for me to see that, because he did not know that the world would be witnessing him in this loving state, right? That a lot of the bluster and rhetoric of Malcolm versus Martin was just that. But that deep down inside, Malcolm cared deeply about the well-being of all Black people, including Martin Luther King. And so it was just a really revealing and beautiful moment as well of strength and radical love, as again, you talk about so beautifully.
Yeah, it's really just that strength, and even in the disagreement. And the thing about, let's understand about Martin and Malcolm is that Martin had this great quote, and I've heard Malcolm say this too, and that is that segregation, it imbues the segregator, i.e. here, white people, with a false sense of superiority. And it imbues the segregatee, i.e. Black people here, and the oppressed with a false sense of inferiority. And this is something I realized that is picked up all over the world, because there are oppressed people all over the world who are dealing with white supremacy in their countries, and they pick up on Malcolm's because his philosophy, his ideology, his speeches, and what he says, because while Martin and the other civil rights groups, they were focusing on tackling the superstructure of white supremacy and the laws, the Jim Crow laws in particular, bus boycotts, lawsuits, Voters' Rights Act, the crimes of killing people, desegregating public places as well as jobs. That's what they're attacking, and you need that so that you have a legal system that will recognize our rights when they are, not when wrong has happened to us. When the Klan marches to your neighborhood, you have to have a set of laws that says they have no right to do that. But Malcolm, through the Nation of Islam and beyond, he was focusing. So they're focusing on the false sense of superiority of white people and changing that. Malcolm is focused through the Nation of Islam, is focusing on the false sense of inferiority. And this is an international thing, as I've come to learn, through the work, through how people were just picking up, Malcolm, over the years, over the decades since his death even, that this speaks to a lot of people.
To hear you talk about it almost sounds like Malcolm and Martin are like two wings on a bird. And the lift comes from both of these. And maybe that's a message not only for a domestic, but a global one.
And Malcolm said that also in his autobiography. He says, we have two different tactics of attacking the same problem. Our techniques are different,
Right.
but we want the same resolution, and that is, that Black people are treated like human beings and allowed to be human beings in this society. He wants everybody to thrive, and both of them are fighting for that. Their techniques are different, but he also, he foretold that, are they going to go after him, nonviolent him, or so-called violent me? Meaning nonviolent Martin Luther King or so-called violent me. And he, was basically predicting that they were both going to be gone after.
Wow. So, Tamara, I wanted to let folks know to just send me the questions directly. I've got a flood of really great questions here. I'm going to try to work through as many as I can.
Okay.
And try to overlap some. So I'm going to invite folks to unmic after I call your name and actually just say your question. So I'm going to go with the question that's directly connected to what we've already been talking about. So I'm going to ask Stephen D'Altero if you wouldn't mind unmiking and sharing your question, Steve.
Is my mic working all right? Am I coming through?
You are perfect.
Perfect. Well, first of all, thank you so much for being here tonight, and congratulations on the achievements of this book. It's amazing and inspiring to me as a student, so I just wanted to thank you.
Thank you, Stephen.
Of course, yeah. So my question was, in your discussion of Garveyism, you talked about that trained and practiced image of self-determinism amongst Black people. And today, so many young people idolize Malcolm X for that unique image that he was able to garner, one of like sharpened intelligence and complete resistance to all forms of oppression. So I was wondering, from your perspective, how has that image survived, and how do we protect that image? Thank you so much.
Well, the image survived because the speeches are still there. If we're going to talk about from Malcolm, is that correct, Stephen?
Yes, it is. Yes.
All right. If we're talking about from the image of Malcolm, but I think it's important that we also give credit, to Marcus Garvey too. I mean, he's still, to understand that a lot of what Garvey is important to us, and important to a lot of these movements that we're seeing that are protecting the rights of the oppressed. I think one of the reasons that this has been able to stay with us is that people worked really hard supporting Malcolm, and they kept his name alive, including people who wanted to know what happened to him, on February 21st. I mean, there are people who never let go of that, even with the outcome of the trial. I mean, his supporters, his friends, they never let go, and certainly not his family. They never let go of they always wanted to know what happened. And so it's to listen to him. Malcolm never left the stage. And as I said, in the 90s, a lot of his speeches were being printed through Malcolm X Speaks, through the Socialist Workers Party and other, and a lot of his speeches started coming out at that time. And it was great just to be able to read what his words and just look at how he was using different words and the images he was portraying. And then thank goodness his recording survived all this time. And we just don't let him die we continue writing about him. This man is, to me, he is so important from the 20th century. I mean, he's one of the most important Americans of the 20th century. And I just think that instead of saying that he was violent, try to understand what it was that he was really speaking and talking about. He was talking about, and the other thing is this anger everybody talks about that Malcolm has. I mean, sometimes I would say anger wasn't necessary, but what he was trying to do was get people to move to be active, proactive, and not reactive. Because when you're reacting all the time, it's like you're constantly, behind. Whereas if you become more proactive, and that's why he was talking about organizing and organizing and doing it across different platforms and attacking different problems, whether it was jobs, whether it was owning your own business, whether it was where your food is coming from, whether it's building up your relations with Africa, right? These were his actions of being proactive.
So Tamara, I wanted to actually continue with that. Thank you so much, Stephen, for that question.
Thank you, Stephen.
And so I want to talk about what that meant to bring Africa into his understanding of social justice, of racial justice, of Black empowerment. And to do that, I want to invite Gabriel Mendez, if you could unmic and ask your question. And if
I'm sorry, I'm having a little bit of AV problems, but can you hear me okay?
yes, you're perfect.
Thank you so much for this event. This has really just been really thrilling and rewarding. My question was around, you mentioned that that Vicky Garvin in the late 50s referred to Malcolm's emphasis on building up local community strength and especially with economic power. I was curious, as it even relates to the last point, like, was there a turning point for Malcolm that it kind of broadened or enlarged his purview into a more internationalist perspective of kind of linking the plight of Black Americans to the wider Black world? Was there a moment or like a trend in his thinking and politics?
But I would say that it came a lot earlier than people might think. I would argue that it came probably when he was even in prison and reading up on the history, and getting a more accurate sense of what our history is and our connection to Africa, as well as other cultures. And so as he's learning about that, I think that's where he's also saying, like, there's a whole country, this is where we come from, like going back to our roots, and then also being fully aware of how people were looking at African in a derogatory way. I mean, during that time in the 60s, and I'll bring it back to even my family, when my father saw Malcolm speak, he said that Malcolm was talking about us and, Black people embracing the term Black. At that time, we were calling ourselves Negro, and he would often say so-called Negro, and then he would alternate with Black. Now, my father said, listening to this, he felt that was bad, and he was pissed off. But he also said, if he called his brother Black, his brother would fight him. But he said that if he called him African, he would be chasing him until now. So these were considered really negative terms in 1963 and earlier, right? And probably even more recent. But Malcolm, I believe, had a real strong sense of our connection to Africa. And probably, I would even say even before his time in prison, I would say it came from the Garveyism, because Garvey also talked about the Back to Africa movement. And now, there are different ways of looking at this too. In looking at Africa, you also are looking at the diaspora, right? The Africans who are not just here in America, but you're looking at the Caribbean, you're looking at in Europe, as well as other parts of Africa, in South America, all over the world, Asia, all these places. So these are all parts of the diaspora. And what Garvey was doing was connecting everybody and dealing with this oppression that we were all facing for the same reason. And then the other thing you can look at is that when Garvey was alive, because Garvey also met with the Klan, and he actually said, look, white supremacy clearly is going to be the rule of the land of America. There's no room for us here. We should just pack up and go back to Africa. I mean, he actually did say this. And, and that could be argued, but you also, let's keep in mind, and instead of saying, how dare he say that, or is he right to say that, you have to put that in the context of what the world looked like at that time. Because the world was different. I mean, Africa was colonized at that point. And here you have, we still have Jim Crow laws here. We haven't had the civil rights movement, when Garvey was alive and working, and before he was deported. And so, the world was different. And then when Malcolm, comes along, certainly in the 60s, you're finding that some of these African nations are able to throw off their colonizers. They're getting away from that. And they still have a growth period to go through. But Malcolm already is on it about connecting up, having African Americans make that connection and feel good about it. Not look at Africa as well as not look at ourselves as not worthy or with shame.
And the way he laid the foundation for even the language of Afro-American or Black American.
Which is something he picked up in Africa when visiting, people like Vicky Garvin, Maya Angelou, and Alice Wyndham, and others who were there. in Ghana, and others, people that he had met, on the continent. But the expatriates in Ghana in particular, they were really using that term Afro-American also.
And, I wanted to just note for folks that Tamara ends the book with Malcolm's voice. And I wanted to just read from the last page, because I do think it intersects with the internationalist who never stops being who he is. Tamara does a nice job, I think, of really recognizing that Malcolm, dies a Sunni Muslim. Malik al-Shabazz is an important part of his identity, and even as he connects to the Muslim world, he still stays rooted. And so there's this letter that he sends to the Islamic Center of Geneva, where they ask him about whether his Islamic identity has made him more of a global citizen that sees all races and identities with a kind of egalitarianism and kind of a unified sense of the human family. And while acknowledging that, he writes, as a Black American, I do feel that my first responsibility is to my 22 million fellow Black Americans who suffer the same indignities because of their color as I do. I don't believe my own personal problem is ever solved until the problem is solved for all 22 million of us. Tamara, I don't know if you wanted to talk about this. I just wanted to acknowledge that you end the book with Malcolm, which his autobiography in some ways doesn't, because he doesn't get to read his autobiography. He doesn't get to sort of have the final edit on his autobiography. But this is the last thing that he writes. The night that his home is firebombed, as you write, this draft of this letter is found in his home. And so this is really one of his final words, and you give him the final word in the book. And so I wanted to put that forward. Tamara, you don't have to respond to that, but I'm curious if you had a response.
It was just really important that Malcolm, a lot of people had questions about that Malcolm after the split. And he's traveling, he does his Hajj and he's traveling. And I think we also have to understand that, here in America, and a lot of Black Americans do not fully understand, Islam and the Muslim world. And even when they joined the Nation of Islam, they were joining it really for a lot of people were joining it because of the community and the stronger community and the strength that they felt in the numbers, that the support that they were receiving there, but not necessarily for the religion. And even the religion that, that was being preached at that time was not true Islam, but it was to be more palatable to meet up with what African Americans were dealing with at that time. But, a lot of times I would hear people talk about Malcolm's message was watered down. He was not as strong as he was. And I wanted clarity on that, but I didn't want me saying it, and that's telling you that. I wanted that, and I think that this is what, is important about this book. Through journalism, through source material, through interviewing, people, and allowing people to explain to you what was going on during that time and why, they had that relationship, why they had responded to Malcolm the way. We really wanted to bring that out because we don't really get to see that. And a lot of these people, unfortunately, have passed on because of, their age. But I wanted Malcolm to really kind of let us know where he was. And those of us who, I'm gonna be honest, we're not even where Malcolm was when he died. In understanding the world and understanding what he was facing, understanding where he was going and how he was going to go. Because I often think about the people that Malcolm was talking to. He was talking to world leaders. He was talking he was talking to Kenyatta, who's head of Kenya. He's talking to Julius Nyerere. He's talking to Nkrumah, first presidents of liberated African countries. He met, or he was trying to meet Haile Selassie. He's meeting with these people. He's going to Beirut in Lebanon. He's at the university, the American University of Beirut. And he's talking with students who have gone on to be, powerful people in today's world. He's talking to them in a situation just like this right now. Okay. Had that relationship, and that was in 1964, had those relationships been allowed to flourish and he was able to live and continue those relationships, can you imagine if this world had continued? Would it play out the way it has? And I don't, that is a question. And we don't have an answer to that. But I wanted us to get as close to an idea to have, in his own words, let him speak for himself as best as he could, in that moment, where he was going with that, to tell us himself. And we, through that, can, take it and do what we will with that. But at least have that information.
Yeah, and as you started at the very beginning, you said that good journalism helps us make informed decisions. And this is good journalism about Malcolm X that hopefully will help us make more informed decisions about the road ahead. I have to tell you, I am getting just flooded with questions about you. And so we do need to, I said at the beginning, we need to come back to you. And so we do need to come back to you. So I'm going to ask first Derek Jackson, if you're on the call, to please unmic and ask your question.
Hi, Tammy. How you doing?
Hey, Derek.
Great. You obviously did a lot of the legwork for your dad on the book before. So I have two questions. One is, what is the piece of your own reporting before your dad passed that you're most proud of? And then after your dad passed, were there any gaps that you had to fill that were tough and that you are also proud of in finishing the book?
Thanks, Derek, for trying to bring me in there. Derek is actually, he worked with my father. He was trained by my dad, actually.
That's right.
So he's being tough on me. While working with Dad, one of the things I would say is, as a journalist, you don't, and certainly journalism that Dad was putting out was training people in it. You don't put yourself in the story. I mean, you may be interested in the story, but you want to find out where the facts take you in the story, and it may take you to a place that you're not trying to go. It may be the opposite direction, and you kind of have to go where the facts take you. And so, for me, Dad had written this chapter. I think it was the Hartford chapter, and he actually had inserted himself in a really early version. He was just like, "This is trash." And I said, "But this is so good, Dad. You have to find a way, because you're part of the story. Because you saw Malcolm speak, and that, what that experience, that, those veils falling away from your eyes in that experience, it's important because that was the transformation a lot of people had with Malcolm. They don't even know how to articulate it, and you articulate it beautifully." So that was one thing. Another thing would be kind of, looking also at the role of women, in Malcolm's life. I mean, Dad understood. I mean, he saw it, but Dad was kind of a man's man, and I, we would have these conversations about what, the importance of women and how these women, and I would kind of bring it up to his attention, how these women were, were important and the roles that they play, especially, throughout his life, even while in the nation, but even outside the nation. And I thought, it was part of trying to get him, to see that part. So that would be while we were working together, but also just for me, that would be some of my contributions to the book while he was living, but me just picking up from him, like how to learn how to interview, how to prepare for these interviews, kind of, just how to make sure you understand who you're speaking to, and knowing and trying to figure a way to get them to go and tell you some of those things that they should not tell you. And if they tell you no, how do you get them to not say no? How do you get that no to be something else? Those were valuable lessons that I learned from him. And then after he died, and it's, I know I'm getting a little emotional because last Friday was the 3rd anniversary of his passing, and I still kind of get, emotional about that. But, there were some unfinished chapters, and there was reshaping of chapters that, that had to be worked on. And like, for example, the first two chapters were one chapter, and, it had to be split. And then going into where do you split it? And then also renaming it. I actually named the second chapter, The Storms of Racism. So there you have some of it.
Thank you.
Tamara, this is a question that I'm not sure who it came from, but it's one that someone submitted when they were registering. But this is kind of calling you and your whole generation, and so I'm wondering if you would be willing to respond to this, and then Chevy, do we have time for one more question after this? I feel like one more. Oh, all right. Okay. So Tamara, I think that there's real interest here in understanding who Malcolm X was for your generation, and I'm going to add to that anything you want to say about this current generation. And I know you've said a little bit already, but for people of your generation, whatever your generation is, however you want to answer that one, I want to put that one out to you.
Who Malcolm was for our generation? My generation?
Yeah.
Class of 1988? Malcolm was important. I mean, I think that, often I hear the story that, and I hear this from so many generations, that Malcolm's like the first, book that speaks to a lot of people. Blacks in particular. Immigrants who come here, they said that was the book that taught them what America really is about. So it speaks to a lot of people. But I think that what Malcolm, for our generation, I think that there are so many lessons that people learn from him. Understanding how the system is set up. Malcolm really gave us a primer on that. I think Malcolm also, in the way that he responds to questions, and like I had pointed out earlier about how he would look at a situation, diagnose it, and then give you a response to it, an action, and then also say, and by the way, not everybody's going to love you for doing that. And we learned from that. And I think that how people translated that and carried that out is, it depends on the person and their character and who they are. But I think that really, that we learned that was an important lesson. And it also helps us to understand and think critically of our lives. He really helped us to do that.
Thank you so much, Tamara. I did want to say, I'm delighted to say I learned who asked you that question. It was Patricia Adams, the daughter of course, Alger Adams, the first Black graduate from Hobart College, who will celebrate his 90th year from when he graduated in 1920.
This is awesome.
Patricia, how was that answer for you? Is Patricia still on the call? Did we lose her?
Yes, no, I'm still on the call. I had to unmute. That was a wonderful answer. As I was listening to you, I did a little homework before checking in, and it was interesting to me that your dad and I were the same age, and so we were in that generation. My dad was born in 1910, so he was 15 years old when Malcolm was born in 1925. And and my dad was also a newspaper publisher. And I'm thinking, your dad looks so familiar, and I'm thinking there must have been a connection there. Although your dad would have been much younger than mine was during that same period. But I must say, you are just enthralling. I have found this entire discussion so enlightening, and it makes me certainly rethink a lot of the stereotypes that I know I was guilty of back in the 60s. And so Khuram, thank you so much for calling on me. Yes, I did wonder what the relevance was, and Tamara has answered that it still has relevance, and it sounds like it's going to continue to have relevance.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And it's really nice to meet you virtually.
Likewise.
So I know I was only allowed one more question, but we're all still here. So I'm going to put one little one, and then I think we have Howard Eagle. I'm going to try to get to his question as well. What's this like? Being an alum, coming back this way. What's this like for you?
It's exciting. And I definitely was looking forward to it. I mean, when the book, look, I've been working on this book for a long time, and I knew that at some point I wanted to make sure that I had a connection with Hobart William Smith to bring this book, because I think that it's pertinent. And I definitely want to keep a direct connection. I mean, I have a direct relationship with this school, this institution. And I want to keep it, a direct connection. But also, it's important for me to understand. I mean, it's been exciting just, promoting the book, and bittersweet. I'm starting to focus more on the sweet now, but it's bittersweet because my father is not here. But I've learned so much just about, how people are receiving this information. And it's just really important that because we're here, that we use this time, this opportunity, this beautiful, opportunity right now to move forward and take this information. Because, one of the things that you and I discussed before, Khuram, is about, I talk about how information is powerful. This is something that's been drilled in my head, that information is powerful, but I also believe information is healing. And I think Malcolm shows us that. And I think this book is also part of that, of how information is healing. At an event, I was talking about how information is healing. And it's like, when we think about, for example, the women who are working at NASA and Hidden Figures. I mean, before understanding that, we didn't know that Black women had any, involvement with that. And there are people who left the planet not knowing that, but once we found that out, it was incredibly healing to know that we had such a major part. Not that, we can talk about it, we can be abstract about it, but to have it confirmed, that they were still alive too, some of them, but I mean, there are others, that are out there that we don't know about, and to know of our role. And I think it's really important. And then for this book, I mean, not only learning about who Malcolm is and his family, but who our families are, because these things that happened to Malcolm's family, or what they experienced, or what they lived through. They were part of the Great Migration. They lived through the Depression. They lived through the World Wars, right? And so on and so forth. But our families did too. And if we look back in our families, we'll find that there are similar stories, and that there are decisions made that impact our worldview now. And maybe it's an opportunity for us to really look back, because I think in order to understand how we got to this moment where we're looking at who we are, talking on this virtual call about this book, or we're looking at January 6th, the insurrection, how do we get to this? We have this history that we need to really look at and deal with. And here's an opportunity for us to do that. And then not only just learning this information, learning this history and understanding our place with it, but also learning from the mistakes and not repeating the mistakes of the past. For example, of keep looking the other way when it comes to racism, institutionalized racism, and white supremacy. And these continued attacks. And when you look at Black people, I mean, it's horrible to look at the news and know, am I going to see a Black person gunned down by the police again? How do we deal with that and confront that and change that? And using history and the lessons of history, to not make those mistakes anymore.
There's and I want to say to everyone on the call, there's a number of really great questions. Howard Eagle asked a question about what we can do now that we know everything we do about Malcolm. There's a question about Manning Marable's book. There's a question about the two folks that weren't prosecuted. And so what I will promise everyone on the call is I'm going to beg and borrow Tamara's time to do a podcast, and we will invite folks to join us to continue that conversation. And so we can continue continue this, but I also am becoming increasingly afraid of Chevy, who's looking at me and looking at the clock. So I'm not going to press my luck, even with these great and important questions. And Tamara, what I will do is to say thank you and to invite you to leave us with any final words on this call before we call it a night.
Go out and buy the book and read it.
All right. Thank you, Tamara. Thank you.
Right. Before we go, I just wanted to once again thank Tamara and Khuram. You know, when I talked with Tamara about doing this program, I immediately had Khuram in mind because of his scholarship, and then they just hit it off. They talk more than Khuram and I talk. And if we let them go, they'd probably take you till 2 o'clock in the morning because they've got so much in common and such synergy, and I've just loved it. And the other thing I want to say is that I saw a lot of parallel between your love for your father, Tamara, and Patricia Adams' love for her dad, and the work that you continue to do to honor them both. And I'm just really glad that we've got this, like two wonderful, powerful women on this call with such great stories who continue to lift up the legacy of your fathers. And to everyone out there who joined us, alums, students, faculty, staff, community members, family members, thank you, thank you, thank you. Tamara, this is an amazing work. I have not finished the book, I will be honest, but I am reading it, but my husband has, and he's told me that is absolutely worth reading, and he's incredibly picky. So let me tell you, when he finished the book, he said, well done, well said, and you will find things in here you will never know or have not known about Malcolm. So go out and buy the book, follow her on Instagram, connect with her via her website, and join us when we have this podcast that Khuram will absolutely set up. We will make sure we get that out there. So again, everyone, thank you so very much for joining us. Have a wonderful evening, and we will see you on the next program.
Can we all unmic and give a warm round of applause?
Good job.
Proud of you, Tammy.
Good job, Tammy.
Proud of you.
Love you, Tammy.
Class of
Great work,
1988.
guys. Thank you.
Congratulations. Thank you.
Class of 88. Class of 88.
Hey, Tammy, it's Linda and Walter. Congratulations. Oh,
Can I find the book at Barnes and Noble?
Yes,
Thank you.
you can, absolutely.
NAACP Image Award winner in the house.
all right now.
Oh, thank you, everybody. Oh, so wonderful.
I love it. Thank you all.
Congratulations.
Congratulations, Tammy.
Thank you. So good to see everybody there. Aw.